So can you temper a fundamentally collectivist viewpoint with a maintained respect across time for individualism? And I think the answer is pretty clear. You can't. I fail to find a society which has done this meaningfully well throughout history or today. China is hugely collectivist, and they're positioned to solve a lot of the problems that we're not. I mean, even though they were, of course, the source of this virus, they were one of the first nations to meaningfully pass its worst effects. Why? Because they have the ability to mandate certain behaviors from their citizens on the, snap of a finger that we simply will not because of our principles and our laws. But China can, and China does. And then also, who is more well positioned to tackle an issue such as climate change? The United States, which values private enterprise, which is, a massive polluter in this global issue, or China? Well, of course, China, because if China decides they want to convert to entirely green energy, it might be very costly, but shoot, they'll do it. And I'm sure they will gain, international applause from especially the caring, empathetic Europeans who are clearly, I'd say, former individualists who we once shared a close tie with, that are now fond of this sort of quasi totalitarian collectivism that they seem to be moving more and more toward as each year passes. I don't trust that they're going to be in the same position they are now in terms of their relatively free societies in 2 or 3 decades. I imagine that they're going to fall under the eye of Sauron, so to speak, and they'll probably invite things like mass surveillance in the name of public safety and a reduction in crime and thought policing in the form of massive hate speech reforms. And you'll see something that is much more similar to what we see today in China than what you see today in the United States. And I think that we understand that the consequences of collectivism at its ultimate end, and it does head toward its ultimate end, because once you accept the premises of collectivism versus individualism, you cannot temper that within that ideological framework. It hasn't been done for a reason, because you can't accept the premises and then make any sort of compelling argument against certain behaviors that the government might pursue. So if you say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, you can't just put the Uyghurs in camps to re-educate them, even if it might cost us our Silk Road 2.0. Even though it might be massively costly in the future, if this somewhat subversive region of China is disrupting our major economic goals, which will lift millions of Chinese out of poverty over the next several decades and put them into a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. Well, if you're a collectivist, you will say, well, we're not killing the Uyghurs. That's not what the government says we're doing. We're simply re-educating them. We're giving them Chinese values. And when they're Chinese thoroughly through and through, culturally and in their language, then they'll be able to reintegrate into society. What's so wrong with that? I mean, what, do you want there to be economic collapse? Do you not want millions of Chinese to be pulled out of poverty? Do you hate China? And how do you argue against that? Exactly. Because it seems to me the only way you argue against that is by saying it's wrong to do that to individuals because they have certain rights that demand respect. You cannot make that argument if you've done away with those things as fundamental, basic premises of the understanding of how a government should be designed. If you get rid of those things, you don't get them back. You can't get them back, especially if the majority of the population believes in a collectivism. This is what's happening in Europe. Look at the trends. Thank God for the United Kingdom. They're leaving the EU. Brexit, I think, was one of the greatest stories of the return to sovereignty and nationalism that we've seen. And it's understandable why. You have this massive centralization of power that makes societies top-heavy. And is that justified? I'd say no. In some cases, it is obviously massively efficient and it is utilitarian. But utilitarianism is not necessarily always the best thing to do. So there's this story right? I don't know the name, and that's my fault. I should have paid more attention in English. But there is a story wherein there's a utopic society. In this society, everybody's always happy, well fed, they don't have a want in the world. What is the price? One, I think, teenage boy or small child is kept in like the center of town in a constant state of suffering, and I think a hole in the ground or something similar to that, or in a cage. And that is the shame of this society. Even though there are so many more people that are, as a result of this, and I forget exactly how the story goes, but basically the reason the society is able to be so pleasant, so well developed, so peaceful, is that they only have to sacrifice this one individual, this innocent boy, and they get to enjoy the massive luxuries of efficiency of the greater good. And that's an important, meaningful story, and it matters. What's the price you're willing to pay? How many people? That's the question. That's what's happened every single time. When you put equity, equal outcome, when you put safety over individualism, it's the same story every time. Is individualism perfect? Of course not. Coronavirus is proof of that. There are some situations which, by virtue of the design of an individual-based system, we will just forever be incapable of handling, as well as our collectivist counterparts. However, if we look inward and pay attention to the state of existence of the individuals, it is a moral question. Do you have the right to live your life the way you see fit as an individual? What does that question mean? Well, do you agree with your neighbor 100% of the time? Do you agree with me 100% of the time? I'd imagine that many people won't. And as a matter of fact, I know that you don't. There are some issues that are so fundamental to our individual persons. For example, hot button issues like abortion, or religious traditions, like what religion is the most correct. Have fun with that argument. There are some things that are so central to an individual that if those things are threatened, they're willing to kill and die to preserve them. For me, I would like to think individualism in and of itself is one of those things. Thankfully, with a liberal tradition, individualism allows us to facilitate these differences in a largely peaceful manner. There is a reason that collectivist societies tend to purge the individuals within them that disagree. Collectivism, by its nature, cannot tolerate dissent. It's impossible. They either have to be retaught, completely silenced through acts meant to make them like individuals submissive entirely, like the Chinese state, for example. Constant supervision by the state, constant tracking, and the thought is that in a few decades they'll have cameras in basically every single spot in the society that are run by AI that basically manage where every single citizen is by facial recognition and being able to recognize you simply by the way you walk, by your gait. And it's just, it's what's that called? It's like that that prison where there's one tower in the middle, and then it's sort of like a ring that works its way around the tower, and there's several layers of prison cells all around, and you don't know when you're being watched, but you're basically always being watched. Collectivism is a meaningfully dangerous way of perceiving the world because it stops respecting the sovereignty of individuals, and the reason you sacrifice that is for the utility and efficiency of serving the greater good, even if it costs you a few dozen, a few thousand, or a few million lives to get there. And so what does this have to do with our current situation with coronavirus? Right? What does this have to do with any of that? Well, individualism is being disparaged because it is not effective in dealing with coronavirus if we remain true to its its central ideas. I'd remind people that there are certain frameworks that you don't get to enjoy the benefits of unless you're all in. And clearly there have been times in our past when we've strayed from these things. We've strayed from the core ideas of individualism. And it's been to the great peril of the most vulnerable communities in our societies. Argue me on this. It's clear. The evidence has been had. There should be no further argument on this. We live in the freest society to ever exist. And, there are even still today flaws. So, for example, the war on drugs, right? We don't respect the individual's right to consume substances as they see fit, even if their act of consuming said substances might have secondary effects on other citizens. So maybe I'm a father and I have responsibility as is my role as a father, and I start abusing drugs, and that costs my child something. It really costs them something. It costs them a stable household, perhaps. It costs them a stable relationship between their parents. It costs them resources because there's a good chance I'll get addicted and start spending money on drugs. It costs them a parent with a clear state of mind. And in today's society, it could cost them a parent that does something terrible, or just in general is just a terrible person that is incapable of raising a child meaningfully well. Is that not a behavior that is at once a right, but also a behavior that can be meaningfully harmful? The two can be true. We have to adopt responsibility to make up for that. And some people won't, and there will always be people who won't. But they are not the reason we should throw out the system. The other systems have been tried. You don't like thousands of people dying from coronavirus? I don't think there are many individualists who do. Of course, there are some crackpots on the fringes who, are basically in the Alex Jones crowd with tinfoil hats who claim that this is all a media ruse that have been concocted by, Nancy Pelosi and subversive elements in China and Joe Biden to distract for the November election. And, I don't think coronavirus is fake. I don't think the New York Times just made up 100,000 names of people who have succumbed to this illness. And that's not what I'm arguing at all. I'm not arguing that people should go out about without wearing masks or that they shouldn't practice caution. I am arguing, however, that the restrictions people are obviously compelled to want put in place by government entities, such as mandates. You can't go outside unless you absolutely have to. You have to wear a mask if you do. And I can't imagine there would be much pushback from this crowd if once a vaccine is developed, it becomes mandatory. Careful. You're crossing a line you don't want to cross. Sacrificing freedom and autonomy for a little bit of safety, for a scrap of safety, and a feeling of relief and comfort that we are so accustomed to as a result of our individualism, that once it is even somewhat threatened, we are willing to just... We want the Stasi. We want the KGB, right? We want them to come in as long as they promise us safety, as long as they make whatever promises we want to hear. Would it make us more safe in the short term? I have no doubt. I have no doubt that if we adopted an approach similar to China, where we were hyper-totalitarian and aimed only, or at least primarily, toward the collective good, we'd probably be much better off over the next few months. We'd probably be able to restart our economy sooner. There would probably be far fewer unnecessary deaths. But the price is to be paid. That is not optional. This is not a free thing. There is a price. It's not one that will show up at your door the very next day, but it is a price. You set a precedent. And in the future, maybe it's a threat that's less threatening than a disease with a very, very, very low death rate that has scared the bejesus out of everybody because of the media. People have died. People will die. And A lot of people are obviously very desperate to prevent that by any means necessary. That doesn't seem to me to be the most ethical approach, especially when the sacrifice you make in the short term leads to a very, very precarious set of dangerous circumstances in the long term, wherein the centralization of power becomes overly top heavy. And when that happens, the only thing standing between you and a very dangerous situation wherein you or your friends or your family have to choose between what you know to be right and a gulag, a death camp, starvation, betraying your friends and neighbors. This is the corruption of the society. This has happened before, and it doesn't happen overnight. It is not the free society that wakes up and welcomes Hitler. It is a decaying society that increasingly becomes willing to trade in freedom for safety and security. It is a false promise. It is a siren song. We accept it out of desperation and mental weakness and lack of principle. And perhaps there are very good reasons that we would like to make that trade, because perhaps the emotions and the tension and the frustrations we feel today seem to be all-encompassing and will last forever, but they won't. And when they pass, if we remain true to our principles, we will thank ourselves for it, and our children will thank us for it. If we ever give in to the demon that is collectivism, we will pay a price. We've paid that price in the past, some more than others. And that's how it goes, right? That's Animal Farm. All animals are equal. Some are more equal than others. In the past, there were the supposed principles of individualism that took centuries to manifest to a sufficient degree as they have in modern America. But for a long time, there was not true individualism. There was collectivism. Whites versus everybody else, white males versus everybody else, white male land-owning class versus everybody else. And thankfully, we're largely past that. And your rights are respected under law. You have economic rights. You can own property, regardless of your color and regardless of your gender. You know, you have a right to freely engage with other individuals as you see fit. You have a right to seek employment where and how you see fit. You have a right to work as much as you want. We threaten these traditions and these rights at our own peril. And so you have to consider, where is the higher likelihood for injustice on a mass scale? In a society that respects the individual or a society that doesn't? And if you just rationally walk through what would happen, you might end up with a situation wherein you have a vanguard class, and this is something that can be explored through Leninism. Lenin was a proponent of, I think, the most famous strain of Marxist ideology that started in Imperial Russia in 1917. His vanguard revolutionaries were essentially tasked with deeming what is the most appropriate form of deconstructing the classist system that existed in the Imperial Russia at that time. There was massive inequality. Massive. Right? Terrible. There were classes of extremely wealthy oligarchs, essentially. And the vast majority of Russia was extremely backward, illiterate, short lifespans, terrible, rugged existences, largely uneducated. And so these vanguards went in and promoted this idea that if we all band together and work toward the common good of our fellow man, we can overthrow the oppressors. And we can make society just. We can achieve social justice, class justice. And what do you have to do to get that? Just stamp out the individuals who stand in your way. They don't care about you. Look how they're exploiting you. They're putting you in danger. Right? They don't care about you, so why should you care about them? And a good critique, especially at that time, I think it would be the rare individual who would have resisted such temptations. Terrible existence. They're rich. Why does it have to be that way? And so they did it. They had their revolution. and it led to a hyper-totalitarian regime that caused millions of people to live and die in absolute fear, a constant state of fear, because the collective good had been hijacked by a moral absolutism that saw the ideology and, for a time, Stalin as the primary focus of what is right in the society, and all else has to be thrown to the wayside. Individualism, who cares? Throw them in the gulag. They don't have rights. That's not a thing. That's not a concept. You can't have both. Is it the common good, common, everybody, and as long as the group exists and the common good still exists, or the individual, which can be a threat to the common good, but not to a very large degree. Individuals are not that threatening in and of themselves. Now, a lot of them are, but that very quickly becomes a case against collectivism. If a lot of individuals working toward a common goal happen to be working toward an incorrect goal, but they have the majority of the power in a society by some factor or another, they are much more dangerous than one or a few individuals that are behaving as rogues and are just being inconsiderate toward the needs of the society. I know which situation I'm taking. It's also a matter of pragmatism. You know, it's who does more damage? Chad at the bar with his bros, coughing and sneezing on the waitress, which is a moral travesty. Or is it a society wherein all of the power is concentrated in the hands of a protective class that has massive amounts of authority to do whatever they deem to be most correct, most right, most in the interest of the common good? Historically, it seems to be the case that those that have the common good at their highest interest seem to be the ones that, when given the most power, tend to cause the most deaths. So, something to consider. Wearing a mask won't kill you. I think most people should probably do that. Seems to be like a small sacrifice to be made to console the more anxious and concerned Americans among us. But at the same time, even if individuals choose to behave irresponsibly, even when the stakes are high, or we care about the stakes a lot, the trade-off we make in sacrificing individualism for collectivism fairly clearly isn't worth it, even if it would be deeply emotionally gratifying right now, and even save lives in the short term. Thank you.